Hello, so the question we're going to have a look at today is evaluate the view that referendums are the best form of direct democracy in the UK. Now, your first thought was this might be quite a tricky question because we only have referendums which are a direct form of democracy, which is true. However, there are two other systems which have a little bit of direct democracy in them. So I think for this type of essay, obviously you discuss referendums, we'd have to discuss these other two systems which have a little bit of direct democracy. One of them is recall of MPs and one of them is e-petitions. Secondly, we need to be really clear what is meant by direct democracy. So direct democracy, remember, is a type of democracy where citizens are directly involved in decision making, whereas representative democracy, in contrast, is where citizens elect people, representatives, to make decisions on their behalf. And I'm going to argue in this discussion, I suppose, I'm going to argue that referendums are the best form of direct democracy that are used in the UK. So, firstly, let's discuss referendums. So, I would say that they are the best form of democracy, of direct democracy used in the UK. They're the clearest form of direct democracy. They do allow the public to vote directly on could be contentious or really important issues, and everyone gets the chance to vote in those elections. So, for example, if you look at the Scottish independence referendum back in 2014, 84% of Scots voted in that referendum. If you look at the Brexit referendum in 2016, 74, I think it was, percent of people voted in that referendum. Both of these referendums had much higher turnouts than UK general elections. So the 2024 general election, for example, saw about 60% of people voting. So clearly, these two referendums really engaged the public. Everyone had the chance to vote, and they had much higher turnouts than UK general elections have had to date. They can also be really beneficial as a way of healing divisions, the argument goes. So if you look at Northern Ireland with its huge divisions, and violence between Catholics and Protestants, the Good Friday Agreement, which Tony Blair negotiated to try and settle the issue there, was then legitimised by the Good Friday Agreement referendum. So a referendum was held across the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Again, it was a high turnout referendum, and the people voted overwhelmingly, I can't remember the exact figures to hand, in support of the Good Friday Agreement. So it's legitimised that attempt at peace, which you might say is, every time Northern Ireland gets into trouble still, it's got that fundamental legitimacy caused by this referendum into that particular issue. And the third benefit of referendums and this form of direct democracy is that they can entrench, they can solidify and legitimise constitutional change. So, for example, the Blair government introduced devolution. They set up a Scottish Parliament, as was then a Welsh Assembly, and also an Assembly in Northern Ireland, because, again, they had a referendum which people voted in favour of these institutions. It makes it much more difficult for a future parliament to get rid of them. And so it's entrenched and legitimised, those institutions and those constitutional changes, all of which suggest that referendums are a great form of democracy. However, and there's always a however, isn't there? There's always a but. There are problems with referendums, as we should know. Do they really heal divisions? Northern Ireland, yes, it's legitimised the Good Friday Agreement, but there are still big divisions in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants. It hasn't ended that. There have been periods where the Northern Ireland Assembly has been suspended. It's back in force at the moment, but there was about 2 or 3 years where it wasn't. Look at the Brexit referendum, that 52-48 voting Brexit referendum. Look at all the divisions it created afterwards. Led to the downfall of Theresa May and, of course, David Cameron. It led to all those protests about Brexit and what type of Brexit. You saw old people voting overwhelmingly in favour of Brexit, whereas young people not. It led to middle class people voting generally in favour of remaining in the EU, whereas many working class voters voting to remove. And all these social divisions, it kind of highlighted Scotland voting yes, England voting no, whole range of divisions. So you could say actually they're not that good for healing divisions. Actually, they can stoke divisions, you might argue. It was John Stuart Mill, the famous philosopher who will come across when we do liberalism, said that basically referendums are a tyranny of the majority. So, look at the Brexit referendum, 52 yes, 48 no. The 48%, which is a significant number of people, have basically been ignored, have they not? And so there are these issues with referendums. Again, the government decides when they're going to be an issue, going to have a referendum. So again, is it really that good a direct democracy? The people not having the say on lots of issues. It's when the government decides to allow the people to have their choice. So despite these problems, I still think referendums are probably the best form of direct democracy because it does allow everybody the opportunity to participate, debate and discuss the issues, and it does legitimise constitutional change. Okay, so that's referendums. So the other two forms of direct democracy are not pure direct democracy. They have elements of direct democracy in them. So the first one we'll have a look at is recall of MPs. So basically what happens is, this was a law introduced in, I think, 2015, if memory serves me right. And basically it means that if an MP has misbehaved, and they're suspended from the House of Commons, and this takes place in a procedure in the House of Commons. So fellow MPs decide that MP X has misbehaved really badly, and they're suspended for a period of time. That can trigger them being booted out of Parliament essentially. So what happens is, let's say an MP has been really bad, they're going to be suspended for a period of time. It's not like 1 or 2 days. It's a much longer period of time. I think it's like 10 or 15 or something like that. It triggers what they call a petition. This is the direct democracy bit. So in their constituency which they represent, so let's say MP X represented, let's say Leicester Central, it would trigger a petition of all the people who live in Leicester Central to just say, do they want to get rid of their MP or not? If 10% or more say, yeah, we want to get rid of our MP, he's been really, really bad, or she's been really, really bad, it then triggers what they call a by-election. So an election to replace that MP. So the direct democracy bit is the bit with the petition in the middle where 10% say yes or no, essentially. In terms of effectiveness, there has been a number of MPs who've been booted out of Parliament through these recall ones. So, for example, and some of them were jumped before they've been pushed. So, most recently was Mike Amesbury. He represented Runcorn and Helsby, I think it was called. In 2024, he thumped a constituent. It was on CCTV. Actually, he did just thump them once. He repeatedly thumped them. He was suspended. He knew he was going to lose in a recall election. When the petition was going to be introduced, he knew that they'd vote to get rid of him. So he jumped before he was pushed. He resigned, which led to a by-election. Boris Johnson, similarly, after being got rid of or booted out as being Prime Minister, all the issues around the COVID and the partisan stuff, basically he was suspended from Parliament. It was about to trigger a recall petition, but he jumped before he was pushed. So in this regard, you could say it's been quite effective. The fact that some of these naughty MPs are actually resigning before it actually triggers it suggests it has some effect. However, there are some issues around recall of MPs. There's nothing to stop an MP who has been naughty and has lost a recall. The petitioner said, yeah, we want to have a by-election. There's nothing to stop that person from standing in that by-election. So Chris Davis was a Conservative MP in Brecon in Wales. He was found to have falsified his election expenses. He lost the recall petition. It led to a by-election. He stood as an independent and very nearly won. Now you might say, well, that's the people. The people, significant number of people in Brecon quite liked him, even though he'd been a bit naughty. You could say it takes a long time to get rid of some of these MPs. So like Boris Johnson, it was over 12 months between leaving Downing Street, all these allegations around, all the Partygate and stuff. It was 12 months before, he actually got suspended and he jumped. So you might say there's been quite a long gap. And you might also argue in terms of direct democracy, well, the role of the people is quite minimum. It's elected MPs who are deciding who is being naughty or not. They're just being asked to kind of confirm, I suppose, what those elected MPs have said. Okay, and the third type, again, not a pure type of direct democracy, are e-petitions. So an e-petition is basically where citizens can sign a petition on the Parliament website. If it attracts more than 100,000 other signatories, or 99,999, so you get 100,000 people to sign this petition, it then triggers a debate in Westminster. It can be in Westminster Hall on the House of Commons. Now, it's then up to the MPs whether they're going to accept that issue, which has gained 100,000 signatures, but it does at least trigger the debate. And there have been a few successes. So there was an e-petition to scrap what was known as the tampon tax. This was a tax, a VAT tax on sanitary products. This gained more than 100,000 signatures. It was debated in Parliament and actually has become law since that date. So that's a real success. However, they're quite rare. Most of them get ignored. Between 2017 and 2019, there were 8,154 petitions. Only 456 of them got a response by the government. Most of them don't make it into law. The one about the tampon tax is a bit of an exception in many ways. So I would argue that unlike referendums, which can have a direct big impact on the constitution and on the future of the country or on a particular issue, e-petitions are largely ineffective. Most of them don't get very far. Most of them can be ignored by the elected politicians. Okay, so to sum up then, I would argue that referendums are the best form of direct democracy in the UK. They're the purest form which are used in the UK. E-petitions and recall are a mixture of representative and direct democracy. E-petitions in particular can be ignored. In terms of recall, the process is begun by the representatives, so the people are only really having a small say on do they kind of agree that their MP has been really naughty. Whereas with a referendum, the decision made by the people has a real big impact on that particular issue, whether it be Brexit, whether it be constitutional change for devolution, or whatever. So therefore, I would argue that referendums are the best form of direct democracy in the UK, but they're not the only ones.